Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series. My name is Guida Armstrong from the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing this session today. The Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series highlights the breadth and quality of our unique special collections and showcases world-class collections-based research activities. Today's session is coming for you from various rooms across the University of Manchester and beyond. And as usual, we'll be showing some of our really outstanding artefacts of our collections and presenting new research on them. So today's seminar is entitled Revisiting British Humanitarianism, 3 Life Stories. And before I introduce our speakers, there's just a few things to mention. So first of all, this event is being recorded and it'll be edited and made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel. Auto subtitles are available using your own settings. We're using the Zoom webinar format, so that means that your camera and microphone is disabled on entry. And at the end of the session, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to add one, please could you put it into the Q&A, and then I'll select them as chair and relay them to the panel. So we should have time to take a few questions at the end, and we're aiming to finish about 1:45 p.m. I would just like to add that this presentation will include some discussion of war and conflict, which may be distressing, but there are no graphic images shown. So without further preamble, I'll introduce you to our presenters today. First of all, we have Professor Bertrand Taithe, Professor of Cultural History at the University of Manchester and Director of Research at and founder of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, or HCRI. Bertrand is the PI of the prestigious Wellcome Discovery Award-funded project Developing Humanitarian Medicine and has an extremely rich publication record on humanitarian medicine, most recently The Politics of Catholic Humanitarian Aid, which is a journal article in French history. His Oxford bibliography's contribution, Henry Mayhew and the Mayhew Brothers, and of course his co-authored book, Humanitarian Handicraft, History, Materiality and Trade, which is currently in press with Manchester University Press and should be out next year in 2025. Presenting with Bertrand is Flora Chatt, the Humanitarian Archivist at the University of Manchester. Flora is part of the Wellcome-funded project Developing Humanitarian Medicine, from Alma Ata to Biotech, A History of Norms, Knowledge, Production and Care, 1978 to 2020. As the archivist for the Humanitarian Archive, Flora is assisting in the creation of an oral history archive, which will gather testimony from key figures across the field in order to preserve vital information that is not contained within the written archives. So thank you both very much for talking to us today, and over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Guida. So just as a bit of a background to the archive, the Humanitarian Archive was founded in 2021, and it aims to collect archives from people and small organisations who do humanitarian work. As it stands, it consists of about 13 individual collections from the 20th and 21st centuries, covering a really wide range of humanitarian work. So medical humanitarianism, aid supply, fundraising, awareness raising. And because of this focus on personal archives, it gives a different aspect in not only showing what work was carried out, but why, what were the motivations behind it, and what effect did it have on these people's lives. So today we've got items from 3 of these collections, all personal collections, which we're going to talk through and just explain their significance and their great potential for research use. So we're going to move on to the first one, which is here. If we get the camera angle on this one. So the first collection we'll be talking about is the Elizabeth Wilson collection. This was actually the first collection that came into the archive. So it was came in 2021, and Elizabeth Wilson was a humanitarian and peace activist. She was based in Huddersfield in the north of England and founded HudFam, which was kind of the Huddersfield accompaniment to Oxfam. And her collection is very interesting. It consists mostly of her slides that she took when she went out on humanitarian work, but also holidays. So kind of this interesting personal angle to them. You can see them here. This is one of her slides from Morocco, the box it came in, and we have this nice blown up version so you can see the image itself. spirituality was very important to her work. She was a Quaker, and that really kind of informed a lot of her work and her motivations for why she did things. So also contained within this collection, as well as her photographs, was she kept extensive, almost diaries. So what you can see here is one of them. And this is a dream diary, actually, but many of her notebooks aren't strictly diaries. They're sort of notes about work, notes about her life, all of these sort of comments and descriptions of her dreams, spiritual research. So it's a really interesting kind of personal insight into the practical things she did, but also what kind of drove her to do them. Also on the table here, we have this letter, which is one of my favorite pieces. So in 1962, she was arrested and served a short jail sentence for protesting against a nuclear missile that was arriving in Scotland to a military base. And after she served her sentence, she wrote this letter to the governor of Gateside Prison, where she was held. And in it, she complains about the state of the prison, stating in this letter that, there wasn't enough enriching activities for the women to do, that they were shown violent movies, that they could have been put to better use, kind of knitting blankets for refugees in Algeria. So it really kind of encapsulates all of the things that motivated her, all of her kind of driving forces and, purposes.
So the reason why we find this collection as being an important one is that Elizabeth Wilson always described herself as a mother of four, as a housewife, but she was also such an important figure in the humanitarian movement of that time, very active in the management of Oxfam, for example. And her travels, as Flora pointed out, were very specific to disaster zones. So the first image you had, this Quaker Service Unit image, which is here, was actually due to a visit. She's 51 when she starts traveling, due to a visit to an earthquake, in the Agadir earthquake, which struck the city of Agadir and destroyed it almost entirely, killed about a third of the population, the biggest earthquake of the 20th century at that time. She went to visit it in order to account back to the people of Huddersfield where their money had been spent. But while she was doing that, she developed a new approach, which is to consider the region more broadly, the development issues, but also the war issues that she encountered. So in this particular instance, she's visiting the Quaker Service Unit in Morocco, which is in fact devoted to the refugees of the Algerian War, the War of Independence of Algeria, which is taking place next door in what was then the French colony of Algeria. And she has developed this approach repeatedly in her career, and it's a very important feature of her travels. So when later on in her life, she actually traveled to India, or when she traveled to Nepal, or when she traveled to Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Vietnam, Cambodia, she always developed this agenda of bringing back home images that could accompany a slideshow that she would deliver to a CND meeting, for example, a pacifist activist meeting, a Quaker meeting, or Women's Institute. She would travel across the country with her slideshows and expose the situation. And she was a keen observer. So, for example, in another picture, she traveled to Cambodia with a bunch of pacifists who were inspired by the Bertrand Russell Committee on Crimes of War that was set up, and who wanted to present themselves as human shields at the border of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They were never allowed into Vietnam, but they were allowed into Cambodia. And when she was in Cambodia, she traveled to the border of Vietnam, and there she discovered evidence of the secret war that the Americans were fighting as early as 1967 in Cambodia, bombing secretly the eastern provinces of Cambodia, making it one of the most bombed areas in the world. Those two girls, central to this image, were actually victims of napalm. So there is another image in the collection which is much more distressing because it shows the scale of the injuries that these girls suffered. This is an important testimonial because no one was then talking about the secret war in Cambodia. This was a war that the Americans denied conducting, even though, and this is to add to the story, those two girls were then evacuated by the American field hospital and taken to South Vietnam not long after their visit. So this is a very interesting picture that we have. This woman who has a very complex personal life, and I've written about this. The Dream Diaries are a unique document about the anxieties of a humanitarian worker in the field. A woman who is very involved in social work in the UK, very involved in humanitarian work, and a woman who actually brings back an incredible visual archive of what you could see in the field at that time.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next collection, which is one that arrived in the library in 2023. Now, this is the archive of a man called Jonathan Fowler, who is an author and former humanitarian nurse. So during sort of the 80s and 90s, he worked in a number of countries as a nurse for Save the Children and also Oxfam. And he kept these really extensive diaries of his work, one of which you can see here. This is one from 1981 when he was in Eastern Uganda as an aid worker during the famine there. So we have several of his diaries, but also because he was an author, what we also have is a number of his published works. So what you can see at the top left here is a play he wrote based on his experience in Uganda. It's a very satirical play. He felt that there were kind of a lot of failures during this time, and he chose to create a play out of that, which I think was first produced in about 1987. This example is also curious because this marbled notebook on the right here is his draft notebook for writing this play. So we have this really interesting kind of transformation of this experience in the archive from its handwritten diary form to its kind of drafting into a piece of creative work, and then in its final published form, in its form as a play as well.
And one of the important features of this collection is really this translation from experience to reflection and art production. And that's a fairly important feature. This is a collection of humanitarians as much as of humanitarian work. And we have therefore a strong emphasis in several of the collections on the personal life and the inner life of people who made a choice to devote their lives or to humanitarian relief work. Now, that choice is not necessarily based on a pure notion of self-sacrifice. And indeed, if you read the diary for Saturday, the 6th of June, a day to remember, excitement, danger, variety. And a lot of the emphasis in that diary is about boredom, about social life, about enjoyment, meeting people, the type of conversation he was having, the type of emphasis his life took at different stages. A number of colleagues in Manchester and elsewhere are interested in this sort of material because it gives you an insight on the motivations and also on the transformative nature of the experience of being a humanitarian. Now, Jonathan Fowler was particularly attuned to the fact that there is such a thing as white savior syndrome. And the play is entirely devoted to the deconstruction of the white savior. So the play is of its time. I'm not sure it will be staged any longer, but it is interesting as a parody, as a satire of what the white savior humanitarians of the 1980s thought they were doing and how local people might respond to it. It had very good reviews at the time, hasn't been staged since. So it's my hope that one day we will get maybe the drama department in Manchester to pay attention to this collection, and we bring people to actually spend a lot more time on the writings of Jonathan Fowler.
Brilliant. And so for our third and final collection. This is one of the newest ones that has come into the library. This is the archive of a man called Tony Redmond, who is an emergency medical doctor and the founder of UK Med, which is the UK's emergency medical team. And he's had a very long career of working in emergency situations since about 1988, but his start was in Manchester, working in emergency medicine in Manchester hospitals. So what we have here is a part of his collection. This is a very interesting collection because it contains a lot of objects, which is quite unusual for an archive. So here we have a flyer for the first organisation that he founded, which would actually become UK Med. It was the South Manchester Accident Rescue Team. So when he was working in the 1980s, he recognised that there was a real need for emergency medicine to be more linked up with ambulance teams and rescue teams to help save lives. So he founded this organisation in order to create that link. I think quite interestingly, this organisation is what transformed into UK Med. In 1988, they went to Armenia to provide medical aid after the earthquake there, and then kind of just continued to do that until in the mid-1990s, they became UK Med. And on the left here, we have a UK Med flak jacket from the mid-1990s. So this would have been worn by UK Med staff in conflict zones to help protect them while they worked. Judging by the date of this one, I think this one was probably worn in Sarajevo in Bosnia when Tony Redmond was there working in a hospital. Crucially, also, as Bertrand already mentioned, Tony was also responsible for a lot of kind of making humanitarian medicine more uniform, applying standards to it. So here we have a guide from the UN.
The United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination.
Yes, I'm quite bad with these, and there are quite a lot of them, but also some patches from the EMT initiative. EMT stands for Emergency Medical Team, and it is a international initiative which Tony helped to kind of found, which aims to give kind of a standardization to each country's medical teams to kind of try and ensure that when medical aid is provided internationally, it is of a good standard.
So I mean, Tony Redmond is one of the co-founders of HCRI. There were a few of us at the time, but Tony has been working with the University of Manchester for a long time, and UK Med was indeed co-located with HCRI. So this is an interesting collection for us because it links our very recent history to a much broader and more important initiative. There are a few things I'd like to pick up from what we're showing you. The first one is that moving from accident and emergency response, hospital accident and emergency response, into humanitarian medicine is not entirely unique to UK Med. In fact, the origins of, for example, Doctors Without Borders can be linked to the French SAMU, which is the equivalent of SMART in the 1960s for at least some of its founders. So there is a linkage with this relationship. The fact also that UK Med originally was almost a specialist unit in terms of disasters. So typically earthquakes in Bam in Iran, earthquake in Haiti in 2010, which was partially at the origins of the Emergency Medical Team initiative. But because of the nature of humanitarian medicine, humanitarian needs, Tony was involved in much more difficult situations. So, for example, Tony Redmond was involved in just coming back from the Armenian earthquake. The next thing he did was to go to basically collect the victims of the Lockerbie bombing in the Scottish town of Lockerbie. The plane had been destroyed by a terrorist attack. So a very traumatic phase of his life, which you can find in his autobiography, which was published a couple of years ago. Very importantly, the work on emergency medical teams is a World Health Organization initiative, and that's a really significant part of our research project, the Developing Humanitarian Medicine project. But it's really about the fact that a lot of these collections are about people who are norm setters, people who are intending not to do something, but to do it better and to improve the standards of humanitarian operations worldwide. And Tony Redmond at this level is an archetypal example of people who are extremely well connected, who knows the failures of the system in which they operate, and who try to remedy these failures by generating new norms, new frameworks through which aid can be delivered. So emergency medical teams are basically attempting to end once and for all the very amateurish responses that one encountered, for example, in Haiti after the catastrophic earthquake of 2010. So that's a general notion that applies to many other collections in the Humanitarian Archive, that we are really dealing with not only do-gooders, but people who are trying to seek a different way of doing things, who are trying to really challenge and revolutionize a lot of what is being done and what they observed in the field themselves. So these three collections give you an interesting aperçu of a fairly well-constructed collection acquisition strategy.
Yes, yes. And I'm hoping kind of over the next few years, as this archive is still very young, only a few years old, that we will be able to expand to kind of collect a variety of different perspectives and stories through these kinds of archives, which don't always reflect the same things as organisational archives. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a terrific talk, and it's given me so much food for thought. I mean, it's, there's such evocative artifacts, especially, as we are right now at a time of absolutely horrific conflict. I really liked your focus on the personal archive and these kind of belongings that have, been in the field, as well as the kind of more usual documentary sources. So I'd like to invite our audience to put their questions in the question and answer box, if they could, and then maybe I can start off with a few comments of my own while we wait. I mean, I was really struck by what you were saying, both of you, about how you're actually kind of in the process of archive generation, and so you're not simply using archives to extract information to do research, but you're actually kind of building them yourself as part of the project. Could you both say a little more about that, maybe?
Yes. Yeah, so it's because the project is producing these oral history interviews, and part of their value is to provide information to the project that is used for research, but also in them being archived as a useful kind of historical research tool. So it's an interesting kind of, watching these archives be produced that aren't currently archives, but will one day be. Another aspect of my work, which I haven't mentioned in this talk, is that I'm working on a digital archives toolkit for humanitarians, which will essentially aim to help humanitarian organisations of all sizes to keep their own digital records. I think particularly with the shift to digital working that everyone has experienced, not just humanitarians, these records are much more difficult to keep track of, to keep safe, to keep usable over the years, which I think many people aren't really aware of. So I'm hoping that this, through providing kind of advice, potential structures for processes, will help people to not just, maintain their own digital archives, but to start thinking about their archives more and kind of how they want their work to be remembered as well.
So from the perspective of the research project, I'd like there's two sides to this conversation. The first point to make is that a lot of the situations we're considering are fragile situations where people were displaced, where states were in the process of collapsing, where archives were physically destroyed. And in some instances, we've identified up to 33 organizations providing relief. Only 3 of them actually have kept any kind of records. So, and most importantly, the people who have kept records are not the ones who ran the show. So we have to conduct interviews to get a sense of what local figures were doing in terms of the coordination of aid in that particular region. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is really to think with archives and to reflect in terms of what people do. So a big part of my work has been to work with organizations like Doctors Without Borders and trying to bring not only history as an analytical tool for them to use in their operations, but also to think their archives as an essential part of their record management, as an essential part of how they're going to construct the narrative and the logic of their interventions in future. So it's, in a sense, we're trying to, we call that synchronous history, the production of archives as a result of research, but also as the formation, the foundation of a new way of thinking about humanitarian work. And in a sense, it's a very ambitious, very ambitious project, you know, a theory of change for the entire humanitarian system. But the purpose is not for Manchester to acquire the collections of all these organizations, but to equip them with the tools that will enable them to think historically about what they do. Because if they do think historically, they will have an opportunity to change the way they program, the way they organize themselves, and the way they relate to the beneficiaries, quote unquote. That is, the people on whose behalf they are generating humanitarian action and whose opinion of their action may well be not as favorable as their own.
Thank you both. That's terrific. So I've got a question here from Jeanette and then one from Tabitha. So I'll take Jeanette first, if that's okay, Tabitha, and then I'll come to you for a live question from the room. So Jeanette's asked, what are the challenges of collecting these records and making them available for research? I mean, I'm sure you could spend many hours answering this, but maybe just a quick one.
There are a lot, yes. Key among them is that they're all very recent, as I said, 20th century, 21st century, a lot of them, and they all deal with incredibly sensitive situations. So the safety of the people kind of who are described, who are, you know, working or receiving aid that are described in these archives, their, you know, safety and security needs to be paramount. So balancing that with kind of allowing people to use this information, because we do want it to be used, is very difficult as well. On the more collecting side, I would say one of the issues of kind of collecting personal archives specifically personal archives related to such kind of emotional and often quite distressing work, is it is quite an emotional process for the donor often. I think a few of them who I think myself and Jeanette have spoken to have said that kind of going through all of this stuff really brings up kind of these experiences in a way that they hadn't really thought about in a long time, and watching this material get donated almost felt like part of their life was kind of, you know, going with it, which I think it is something we are very careful with, but it also speaks to kind of the power of this material, that it has so much of this kind of this emotion and this importance invested in it. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to balance, but I think it's what makes it worthwhile as well.
I think an additional difficulty is the ethical weight of those collections. I mean, in a sense, in many instances, these records are going to be the only records. And this is because either the other organizations haven't kept the records or more systematically destroyed them. That has happened in a very systematic fashion, for example, in relation to major United Nations interventions as late as the early 2000s. So the destruction of archives and the obliteration of an entire history of the lives of hundreds of thousands of people makes even the fragmentary records that we brought in really essential, because they are going to be, in many cases, the only photographs or the only accounts that you will find anywhere in the world in relation to very often disenfranchised, displaced, and victimized people. So there is a big responsibility for us to do this well and to do it in a way that's going to be accountable for future generations. So that's a really important feature. We have to do a lot of rescue, quite literally, of archives where people are. The one individual who kept records from a refugee camp in the border of Cambodia in the 1980s is about to move house, and suddenly you have a few months where you can collect those boxes. And those boxes matter because the material they contain is unique. And I think that is a sense of urgency on the one hand, but it's also, I think, a big responsibility for us.
Thank you. Yeah, Tabitha, would you like to unmute and perhaps put your video on and ask your question?
I'm so pleased that you were talking about the emotional burden on the archivists of this kind of collection, because there's been a lot of work, for example, by Anna Sexton on trauma-informed archiving for social services in this country, but not for this kind of humanitarian work. So that's fantastic. I actually wanted to ask you something else, which is for both Bertrand and for Flora. So far, we've seen primarily archival objects and one publication. How do you deal with grey literature? So that's normally defined as literature that is published but not commercially. So it might be papers produced by small organisations or societies. I don't know if you had anything to say about about the kinds of material that might be, and Flora about how you might handle that, the scope of your collecting.
Well, we have a few collections that brought in a lot of rare grey literature. So typically, this would be, for example, the guidelines or the ways of doing for a refugee camp at the border of Afghanistan, for example, in the 1990s, or a refugee camp in Cambodia in the 1980s. These were fairly broadly circulated at the time, but within the perimeter of a very small number of organizations. Most of these organizations haven't kept their records or haven't repatriated the records, which means that these publications are now extremely rare. And these publications were often roniotyped. They're not produced in a modern sense. They're more like photocopies assembled, stitched together, sometimes on thermal paper. They can be quite fragile. They're very rare, and yet they're very rare and very valuable at the same time. So one of the things that's coming up at the moment is people coming up to us and saying, we've got a collection of these documents. I kept my documents. And I guess the difficulty will be for Flora to identify which ones are really rare and which ones are not so rare.
I think that is the difficulty, yes, particularly when, you know, the varying organisational archives that this grey literature was produced for, generally it's hard to tell exactly what items, what reports they have in their archives, so it's hard to tell what already exists somewhere. I would say also in terms of classification, I find grey literature quite tricky because it's sort of somewhere between archives and books. So for practical reasons, in terms of cataloguing and making information about it available, it is quite difficult to deal with. At the moment, the way I've been kind of looking at that is, how did the person who donated it treat it? Did they see it as a library of books or as archives? But it is certainly difficult, yes.
There are some rare books included in the collections,
yes,
that were given to us, and books that were printed, but with a very small circulation run. Again, quite localized. And I mean, it's worth remembering that in some of the countries we're talking about, the national archives were systematically destroyed. So, or the national libraries were systematically destroyed. Very recently, I believe that has happened in Khartoum. So there is a number of places which used to have half-decent records or very good records where those have disappeared. Afghanistan had a wonderful library constituted by volunteers, and it is still there, but access to the library of the University of Kabul is not universal, let's put it that way. So there are a number of things like that which make those grey literature, those texts, those publications rare books in a funny kind of way. They don't look like rare books, but they really are.
I would say also on the preservation issue, as Bertrand mentioned, lots of them are printed on thermal paper, which fades incredibly quickly. So we have some that are kind of barely 30 years old, which are almost unreadable at this point. So that is a very serious concern as well, if that's the only copy of that piece of literature.
Or they're very poor smudge copies because they were printed on a with a roniotypes, and so if they happen to be not the first print, the more it went, the less legible it became. But there's an awful lot of that material, and it's interesting because it keeps coming. This is something that we see people volunteering now to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, again, I've got so many questions to follow up on because it's just, fascinating and really, really urgent and important work. I mean, you are, a conflict response institute, but I wonder, do you capture the voices and the experiences of people who are in the disasters as well as the responders? How do you manage that? For example, have the people whose archive passed on, did they take their own records? Did your kind of militant Quaker do interviews? Is that something which you're building up as well?
I mean, there are several ones. There is a lot of work that was done at the time where interviews, records of the voices of people are in the archives. I'm thinking about, for example, the protection archive for Afghanistan in the 1990s contained a lot of material from Afghans who were involved in the processes. But we are also, because of the work Flora is doing, we are also talking to current grassroots organizations, frontline archives, if you want to call them like that, people who are doing important archival work in very, very difficult circumstances of violence, civil unrest, and potential genocide even. And one of these organizations, we did an archive training, well, Flora did an archive training session, we did an ethics session, and they are collecting data for their own sake that they're going to keep. We're just part of this kind of engagement with them, trying to help them do this important work. It's important work because it's a register of atrocities as well as a register of voices. Now, notoriously, humanitarians are top-down. They tend to be supply-driven and not demand-driven, and they don't often pay that much attention to what people ask for. They arrive and give them what they have. That is essentially the critique of humanitarian aid, and as a result, you do find some of that critique come back in the archives through the records. In terms of the oral history we are conducting, in the next phase of our research project, we are going to conduct a lot more work on patient groups, for example, and groups of individuals who are recipients of aid, whether they liked it or not. And these people their voice, we are going to have to think long and hard about where it is best preserved and whether their voice is going to be preserved more locally or where it belongs, if there is an archival depot, or is brought back to Manchester for preservation. There are issues of language, there are issues of confidentiality and of course the vulnerability of the people you interview. So that's the next phase for oral history project. At this stage, what we tend to have is the key actors of the organization of relief. And those include people from the country, it's a very internationalized phenomenon. When I talked about the white savior mythology, it's a bit of a mythology now because most of the humanitarian workers are south-south. So it is no longer true that you get a bunch of white people traveling to the south ill-equipped, as Jonathan Fowler described for the 1980s. Nowadays, it's about 70% of the expatriates of the humanitarian system are actually from the south themselves. They just happen to be in a different country. So you have people from Myanmar who are in Kenya and vice versa.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's fantastic as well that your archive, because it's longitudinal, can show the evolution of these debates and actually how far back they go, with the satirical play that was produced in the 80s. And I was just thinking as well, I suppose the digital medium means that you can kind of co-locate resources as well. So
absolutely. That's certainly the case for one potential collection that we haven't got yet, but we will have to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting chance to think about, you know, how you can sort of hold material in a way that makes it more available to the people who it is most relevant to. So instead of just kind of taking stuff in and, you know, holding it and, you know, very strictly limiting access, if we have this material, what can we do to make it available to people and to make sure people know where it is, and that, you know, within legal restrictions, they have every right to see it and to use it.
But it's worth remembering the intensely political nature of what we're dealing with. The material we're dealing with is fundamentally material that is an embarrassment for states, for armed actors, because it contains the record of their mismanagement or their atrocities or the crimes they may have perpetrated. So there is an element of risk associated with the archiving that was done by those people, and a risk for them to keep it. So that's also something else to keep in mind, is that sometimes perhaps Manchester might become a temporary home for a collection that really belongs to people somewhere else, but they can't keep it right now, but they will want to have access to it.
Mm-hmm. And these kind of extraordinarily sensitive considerations are informing each one of the decisions that you're making around the objects that you receive.
It's not an open access.
Yeah, absolutely. We have time. If anybody else has got one more question, you can put it in the chat, but I've just, Jeanette has flagged a future project where you'll be hopefully doing a literary partnership with some women who've been sharing things. So perhaps you'll be able to come back and talk about that in due course. I've got another question here just for now saying, you know, do you have any other collections that reflect the standardization of emergency medicine and humanitarian relief?
We do, yes. We have a few. As Bertrand mentioned, we have quite a lot of collections of grey literature, specifically a collection of grey literature donated by a man called Ron Upwell, who during the around 80s to 2000s worked as a humanitarian consultant, specifically on developing guides for humanitarians. So we have this quite large collection of grey literature, which are kind of, you know, official printed copies with his notes on, and things like that, which can show you kind of the development of these guides and of these standards, and how they came to be, how they were discussed, how they were argued over in some cases. So it's a really interesting collection because you can kind of almost see this sort of development of these standards and the problems that keep coming up. So yeah, we do have a few collections like that as well.
Thank you. I mean, I just think it's so important that we have these, but it's also so important that we engage with them in such a thoughtful and committed way, precisely because we are a record of disaster and you know, terrible personal events. So I think it's something that I'm very proud that we have in the library, and we have academics working with it in such a way. I think that is probably, we're coming to the end. So thank you both again for that fantastic presentation. Thanks to everybody for listening and for the questions and comments. I'd also like to thank the tech team who've kept it all running behind the background, and also kept me running because I haven't done one of these for a while. So I had to be, you know, supported through this. We hope we'll see you all again for our next seminar. This is entitled Seek Heritage in Colonial Collections, Conservation, Digitisation and Community Engagement with Contested Collections at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. So that's going to be happening on Thursday, November the 28th, which is next Thursday. There are details in the chat about this. And it's going to be co-presented by Gurtek Singh, who's an honorary research fellow at the John Rylands Research Institute, and Jamie Robinson, who's the head of imaging. So I hope we'll see you all again there next week, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.